Before I get started here, I want to take a moment to thank my opponent Haley for doing this round with me today. We both thought that we were done after our after our tournament in Longview, but it's really exciting to have one more round before we both graduate from Snow College tomorrow. Also, thank you to our judge/observer, Dr. Ingram. We appreciate this opportunity to do this round for you. So, without further ado, we'll jump right in. The resolution that we've been asked to debate today, and that I stand in firm affirmation of, is the United States federal government should address inequality within the criminal justice system. Now, I'm going to argue today that just on preponderance of evidence, we will show that inequality is one of the biggest problems, if not the biggest problem, in America's criminal justice system today. And this inequality really boils down, as I will show in my case, to racial issues. It really does go down racial lines. Now, some background. Of course, last year there was the Michael Brown shooting by Officer Darren Wilson. There were riots in Ferguson, Missouri following this, and ultimately Officer Wilson was acquitted of any wrongdoing in that case. More recently, there have been the Freddie Gray protests and riots in Baltimore, Maryland, and thankfully those officers have been charged in the murder of Freddie Gray, but I'm going to show that there are still more problems to address. So the three main points that I'm going to make today is that number one, the system is clearly unequal. Number two, these injustices are institutional, not just anecdotal. And number three, this leads to inequalities in other areas of civic life. So first, the system is clearly unequal. The United States actually imprisons a higher percentage of its African population than South Africa did during apartheid before 1990. Also, 60% of our prison population in the United States are ethnic minorities. Now, if they're minorities in the population, reason should tell us that they should be minorities in the prison population too. But a big majority, 60%, of our prison population are minorities, which shows a clear bias. Also, black men have a 1 in 3 chance of getting arrested at least once in their lifetime, and that's unbelievably an outrageously high number. Now, on to my point number two. These injustices are institutional, not just anecdotal. Now, a lot of people could say, well, you know, there's all these different issues. There's the Freddie Gray problem, there was the Michael Brown shooting, but these are just isolated incidents. However, as we've seen from the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, it sought to specifically address a problem between the sentencing of black people and white people, because mandatory minimum sentences were actually targeted towards crimes that African Americans are more likely to commit. And there are still discrepancies. For instance, the minimum sentence required for crack cocaine, which is used more by African Americans, is actually a much higher sentence than that of powder cocaine, which is much more used by white people. Now, also, the death penalty is drawn on racial lines. A study found that 82% of death sentences have a racial element. And just as a smaller example of this bigger problem, the state of Colorado the African Americans make up only 6% of the population in the state of Colorado. However, 100% of their death row inmates are African American. So this just shows even more of the race divide along these lines. And now on to my final point, which is this leads to inequalities in other areas of civic life. The justice system, as I have shown, is clearly unequal, and this is something that the government ought to address. However, this bleeds over into other things. Justice is an underlying feature of civilized life. If we don't have some kind of conception of justice in our society, it's hard to say that we can really build up a fair life in any other area. Now, the political science professor at Yale University, Vessela Weaver, just published a study last year that showed that African Americans, because of all of these problems in the justice system, have actually become disillusioned with democracy as a whole. In fact, they found that just by being imprisoned unfairly, African Americans are 22% less likely to even want to vote, and that number increases after each incarceration. So we're seeing black people, African Americans, withdraw from civic life, which is actually causing an unofficial apartheid in our political sphere because they're not voting for those who would better represent them in government. So for these reasons, I argue that the U.S. federal government should address inequality issues within the criminal justice system. I will now open myself up for 2 minutes of cross-examination.
Okay, so thanks for the great speech. Just a few questions, mainly like on your second point. Can you just summarize your second point and really like separate it from your first?
Yeah. So my first point really just shows what the problem is. My second point shows that it's institutional, that it's built into the laws, that it's not just isolated instances. So, for example, the example I gave was mandatory minimum sentencing. The mandatory minimum sentences are actually higher for crimes that Africans are more likely to commit, and lower for crimes that whites are more likely to commit. So these aren't just isolated instances. These are actually examples where the laws themselves are biased against the African American population.
All right, and would you say that like the actual reinforcement of these laws and like implementation of these laws is part of the criminal justice system?
Yes, absolutely, and that's the problem. The criminal justice system needs to be reformed in order to fix these problems that give a disadvantage to those of African descent as well as other minorities.
All right, sounds good. That's all I have.
Great.
All right, so I'd like to thank my opponent for a great speech, and I'm just going to start by going over a few points that I have that are going to be constructive on my part, and then go over to his side. So first of all, the thing that we need to be looking at is really what's going to be effective to focus on in order to change the criminal justice system. On the negative side, we're not going to say that change is not necessary. It's more of how to efficiently gain this change. So the United States federal government addressing inequality within the criminal justice system. So specifically, like the change should be happening within it, to stop inequality. But more so, you're going to realize that this isn't going to be done most efficiently through the criminal justice system. So first, we're going to look at behavioral health. Second, we're going to look at how addressing inequality is better looked at through police enforcement. And last is really like where the major faults are and how we can change this in other areas. So first, behavioral health and mental health. So this kind of goes along the lines of drug use and substance abuse. And so the idea of the statistic that he gives about like power cocaine versus different types of cocaine, of what race is more likely to use that type. So behavioral and mental health should be taken care of in a more rehabilitative way. But this doesn't necessarily come through the criminal justice system. This more becomes through society. So the United States federal government should spend more time addressing like concerns with behavioral and mental health in a sense of helping rehabilitative systems and giving more aid to those to give more free treatment, because the more free treatment that we have outside of the criminal justice system, the less chance we have of people actually getting to that point. So when we put more money into rehabilitative centers, especially state-run centers, things like that, mental health facilities as well, we have less people that are even at risk for even being put into the criminal justice system. So this is where the first inequality starts, is the people that we're charging, the people that we're actually forcing as a society to act in this way and encouraging those. So when we have a rehabilitative society, when we have a society that is more equal per se, then you'll see that these problems are far better efficient and far better addressed in other areas. So the next point is going to be about police enforcement, which in cross-ex, I feel like this is going to be messy, so I'm going to clarify this now, in a sense that police enforcement is separate than like the criminal justice system in and of itself. So I think that the criminal justice system is going to be like when you're prosecuted, when you're convicted, all of those things, and then once you're in like actual like jail, prison, and whatever it be. So police enforcement isn't going to fall under this. So addressing inequality within police enforcement, so that would be cases like Michael Brown and Freddie Gray, right? These are things that we should invest more time addressing within like police training, with training the police officers of who to convict and racial profiling and like laws considering that. And so when we face inequality within that sense, again, you're keeping the people out of the criminal justice system as a whole. You won't have these problems of A, overpopulation of prisons, and B, this skewed number of having minorities versus the majority, right? Like you should have an equal prison system within the idea. So all of the statistics that he brings up on the first point are all about kind of that idea of like these are the people that are initially getting caught. So that's a problem within the police enforcement, not necessarily within the criminal justice system and convictions and things like that. So last is going to be kind of what this whole entire case is that more efforts in society should be put into society and a rehabilitative and accepting society and outside of the criminal justice system. There are changes that need to be within the criminal justice system, but the United States federal government focusing its attention onto these areas are going to be a lot worse because the problems are systematic in a sense, but they're more systematic in our social inequality. So going on to his case, first we're going to look about how the system is unequal. So again, like look to my case about how like the people who are initially getting there, like that is where the first step of inequality is made. And so once we address that and socially, like the social ways of society are going to affect the system far more than what just like changing the system initially would do. And then about how it's like institutional. So these are laws that would all be better effective, better taken care of elsewhere. And so these institutional laws, like while they can change, the social change has to become before this law change because laws reflect what we want as a society, which is going to take me into his third one, which really is what this debate is probably going to come down to, is the whole entire idea that the justice, he talks about how justice is like the underlying idea of like what and how we act as a society, but I'm going to argue the opposite, where our laws are reflective of what we want our morals to be. Our laws come into play through like the good old system of politics where we vote and we do all of these things that say how we want our laws to be and how they want to be changed. The only way that these laws can be changed are through a social change, are through a rehabilitative way where when we realize that this inequality is happening and we're not okay with that, and so we want to change it on our criminal justice way, or on our criminal justice level. And so the best way to do that, again, is by focusing and addressing on making these inequalities change within better areas like behavioral mental health and with police enforcement. Because once those change, then the laws are going to reflect that, as well as the justice system. Society changes justice. Justice doesn't necessarily change society and how we think. And that is why you will be voting in the negative today.
All right. So I have a few questions about your case and some of these other things. So first of all, on your first point of behavioral and mental health, how does programs that are meant to keep people away from doing these crimes, like drug crimes, these other things that they're incarcerated for, how does that avoid the problem of the stigma of people that are already doing them?
So, like, the more that we want to rehabilitate somebody, the more that we want to aid somebody, that's going to, like, kind of level the playing field, I guess. And so it just keeps people out of these problems in and of themselves. The more we rehabilitate the African American population, the more we teach them that, like, they don't have to put themselves in those situations, you know, because, like, it's you know, they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to be active citizens if we treat them as if they should be.
Okay. And then on your second point, you said that this was probably going to get messy in cross-ex, and I think you were right. I don't understand this distinction between police enforcement and the criminal justice system. I really don't see how those are different. Could you clarify?
Yeah, so like the criminal justice system, like I'm thinking it, and like maybe we should have like defined this, and like let's come to a good definition right now. Of like, so the police enforcement isn't necessarily like part of the criminal justice system. So criminal justice system is like the legal aspect of it, so going through courts and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay.
That's my definition.
So that's your definition, that's
Yes.
your distinction?
Yes.
Okay. And then when you talk about how society changes laws better than reform and laws change society, do you have any examples of that? Any empirical examples?
Well, yeah, for sure. Like, we look into history in a sense of, like, where we have all these social movements that happen that affect law. And so, like, look to, like, racial discrimination in its, like, a pure form, right? When, like, we started, you had a ton of social movements that ended up changing law.
Mm-hmm. Prohibition,
like, typical huge social movements.
And that is out of time for questioning. So I will go on. 3 minutes speech, right? Okay, well, I want to thank Haley for a great first speech and also providing some great clash. I feel like we're going to have a really good round for the next few speeches. So I'm just going to jump right in and uphold my case against some of the things that were said by my opponent, and then I'm going to go against my opponent's case. So the main point that my opponent makes is that laws reflect what society wants, and that if we're going to address these problems, they have to be taken care of in other ways outside of the criminal justice system before we can deal with them within the criminal justice system, and that law follows society. But I would argue that that's not necessarily true. As I explained in my first speech and on my third point that really went untouched, is that justice is one of the underlying layers that uphold the rest of society. Justice is absolutely foundational. And so we need to do these things from that bottom level in order to affect upward. You can't really affect the foundation from the top floor, but the foundation is what holds up the top floor, to use a building metaphor. And so I just want to argue that this simply isn't true. Just like with Jim Crow laws in the South, my opponent says, look, this came out of a social movement. Yes, but it was a social movement to change the laws. And then it's been a battle ever since then, but we've been able to make more and more progress with people accepting minorities. And so I argue that this goes the total opposite direction that my opponent says. So then she talks about behavioral and mental health. And I argue that this legitimizes the problem of victimless crime laws and all these other things that I have shown disproportionately target minorities. She's going to say, well, we're going to help these minorities not do those things in the first place. Where I argue that we shouldn't be punishing them for doing them in the first place. It's a problem in the justice system first. And speaking of the justice system, on the second point, I just don't buy this distinction between the police and the criminal justice system. And I really don't think that you as an adjudicator should really buy this either, for obvious reasons. Also, it just doesn't deal with the problem of the people that are already in prison. We're going to say, okay, the police are going to do better now, but these people that have already been in prison, they can't be released and have the injustice fixed without these laws changing. And then on the third effort, where she talks about how more effort should be taken by society, again, I argue that laws change minds. The common argument for people when the privileged class looks at all these problems that are happening to minorities, they say, well, if they would just follow the law, there wouldn't be a problem. Well, that argument, we need to get rid of it by changing the laws and establishing a system of justice first. And as our conception of justice becomes more just and more proper, society will then follow suit, and these social movements have room to make the changes in the minds and hearts of each individual person to become more accepting of society's differences. So for this reason, my opponent's case does not stand.
Alright, so I'm happy to be wrapping up the NAIG side of this round today. So we're really going to be only looking at two main points of really what the ideology of this round comes down to. So it's first of all going to be like how does the criminal justice system affect society, or vice versa, society criminal justice laws. And second is really the implementation of this and looking at like how this would look in a practical world. So first of all, when we look to the whole entire idea that the social, it's really coming down to the debate of what affects society, what affects the laws. And so going back to the, Morgan uses this great example of the Jim Crow laws and how it was a social movement to change law. And that is exactly what I'm saying, and exactly what the NAIG side is going to be advocating for, is that we need a social movement in order to change laws. The United States federal government should not address the criminal justice system, necessarily more of the ideas that are going to change the criminal justice system in the long run. Because if the United States doesn't actually address the social movement that's happening like Ferguson, or like these huge social movements that are currently happening, if we don't pay attention to them, or if the United States federal government is just like, these aren't important, then we as a society are going to brush them to the wayside as well, and these laws aren't going to change. Jim Crow laws, the social movement that happened, is what affected those laws to change, is what actually put those into play, is what gave enough potential, enough motivation to change those laws. So the United States federal government should address and spend time actually giving legitimacy to these social movements in order to make that better. And the way they do that is through like supporting behavioral health, mental health, through having these